I am William Jamal Wright.
And I'm Hattie.
And this is our podcast, HattieJo. What are we doing? So this episode, it's the month of November, my birthday month.
Happy birthday.
A little bit
Happy
older,
birthday.
a little bit wiser, getting a couple more gray hairs, But Hattie has a very interesting article that we're going to discuss, and I'll let you do kind of the introduction.
Oh, thank you. So when we thought of this podcast, we wanted to talk about things in our life, but also things that are kind of going on and that we would kind of just talk about. So something that was extremely interesting to me and much of the science world, and I think it's interesting to a lot of people.
Yeah,
I don't know if it got mainstream press.
No, definitely.
But it appears we have the first genetically engineered human beings.
The future is here.
The future is now. So what happened, and so what I would like to talk about today is just what we kind of feel like the ethics are and how people feel about this, how we feel about this concept, but then also maybe a little bit more of the specifics of what took place. I don't know if we'll get to the specifics, but for the background story, in China, a researcher who did his PhD here in the United States, actually.
He actually attended Rice at Stanford.
At Stanford University, right. And he owns several companies that do this gene editing stuff, and his advisor at Rice is like on the board of directors of multiple of these companies. And so this guy at Rice, as well as this Chinese scientist, are kind of, like, the Chinese scientist is the one that was in charge of all this stuff, but he has a supporter here in the States. So it's a really broad statement to say, like, human genome editing resulting in live babies. But what took place was the scientists used this technology called CRISPR, specifically the CRISPR-Cas9, to edit some of the DNA in a human embryo. So they did this right after sperm and egg were joined. And the purpose of this was to try to see if they could incur resistance to HIV. So that's a pretty noble goal. HIV is a debilitating virus resulting in AIDS, which is an even more debilitating, life-threatening disease. And so what they did was I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this, but so if you have HIV, there is an extremely high risk of transmission to any sexual partner you have, but also to any child you have. And that's true whether you're male or female. And so what this scientist did was offer to couples, one of whom has HIV, hey, I have this idea for some way that you can have the chance to have a baby that doesn't have HIV, which, as you might imagine, for someone that has that disease or their partner has that disease, they probably think, I can't have a kid because without the child having HIV as well. So this, I'm sure, was like an amazing opportunity. But we'll kind of talk more about that later. So what they did was use this gene editing once they had the sperm and the egg to make a single embryo. They used the gene editing to try to give a gene, or maybe it was delete a gene. It was delete. So one of the ways that HIV gets into your system, so what viruses do is once they're inside your body, they insert their DNA into your cell's DNA, and that's why a parent can pass off HIV to a child. Mm-hmm. But HIV, it gets in by attaching to a receptor on your cells. And so what they did was use the CRISPR technology to try to deactivate that particular receptor. Mm-hmm. So even if an HIV virus gets inside the body, the HIV virus can't attach to the cell and insert its DNA. Mm-hmm. So that's their premise for why this solution would help prevent HIV. Yeah. So there's a lot of ethical concerns, in my opinion, but the situation that resulted was there were 2 embryos that were successfully viable after this procedure, and they were implanted in a human female uterus, and she had twins. And another thing to note is that in one of the twins, the CRISPR technique appeared to work perfectly, whereas in the other twin, it wasn't perfect. So when you start out as an embryo, as just a sperm and an egg, you then divide into many cells and eventually grow into a full human being, made up of trillions and trillions of cells. So what happened in the second twin was that in some of the cells, the gene was deleted, but in other cells, it persisted. And so the CRISPR technique worked in some of the cells, but not all of them.
Yeah, this is for one of the twins.
For one of the twins. The other twin, it worked in all of it. So, yeah, so I think there's many questions here, and I think the biggest, highest level one is, do we think that this is ethical? Why or why not? And there's additional things we can talk about the way this was brought about, which I also feel like has some ethical discussions. But as a scientist who does research with human beings, granted mine is not as invasive or as intense as this, but it's always interesting, the question of what is ethical and what is allowed. You know, in the past, if you were a prisoner of war, or if you were in jail or some other type of thing, they would often use you as an experimental subject without your consent.
What?
Yeah, this happened a lot in many countries throughout the world.
Huh? I did not know this.
Yeah. Some being more horrific than others.
I can only imagine.
Well,
so in the article, they talked about how gene editing, it's not allowed in the States, but because he was in China, they basically did a workaround and were able to get it approved. And so the fact that this is not allowed in America, I feel like we're pretty if anybody can find a way to make $1 off something,
it's Americans.
Yeah. So and I feel like an American would find Americans would find a way to go. But I also feel
I also feel like if there's any place that's going to have religious zealots that are going to be totally against something, there are many places, but one of them is America. Yeah. And I feel like the concept of messing with God's will, or playing God, or that I think goes against the grain of many fundamental religious people of many different religions.
Yes.
And so I think that you have a large base of supporters for that in America, and for that reason, this particular technology, which you would normally think, I mean, this is just my opinion, you would normally think people would be rushing to capitalize on.
Yes.
It's illegal here in the States. So yeah, I don't know. I think that the place we're at right now with what this researcher did is unethical, but I don't think it's unethical because he was engineering the human genome. So
hold on. So you think it was unethical, but you don't think the reason why he was doing it is unethical?
Yeah, so I know that doesn't make any sense. So let me explain. So I do think that the full ramifications of this, which may be something like, oh, we're going to have a baby. Let's see. I want it to have green eyes, and I want it to be strong, and I want it to grow tall. So we're just gonna genetically engineer it, right? Or I happen to be a millionaire, so I can pay for having this, and my child is going to be the cream of the crop because I, picked all these traits. Whereas people that don't have that much money, you have to have a natural baby, that could have these issues, or right? And that's the most
simplistic.
Right. But in this case, I think he was trying to prevent a very debilitating disease.
Yes.
And so I support that goal. I don't necessarily support the way he did it, but I don't believe that doing this to help prevent this crazy disease is on the same level as, oh, well, I chose, like, a designer baby.
Yes.
But what I do think is unethical is two things. The first is, in the one child, the technique didn't work completely. So that particular child is still at high risk. And the other thing is, with this procedure, we don't, well, not just with this procedure, but in general, we don't understand every single gene and every single major effect, right? So any type of drug we have in this anywhere, it's like, well, here are the side effects. It only happens in, like, 1% of the population, but you never know if that's going to be you because each person's body chemistry is so unique that they can't, even though they can test 100 million times, they still don't know every single interaction someone's going to have, every single little detail. And so I think it's extremely unethical to bring a human being with this altered genome when you don't know all the other
ramifications.
Yeah, and those are called off-target effects. So by changing this one little gene, you don't know if the only thing that changes is now they're HIV resistant, or if a cascade of other things change, or just a few other things that, functionally this child will never notice, or if they will maybe have some other terrible...
Once they take 8 years old, their immune system will completely fail.
Exactly, or it might be some personality thing or some mental thing. You have no idea, and so I think that's absolutely extremely unethical, right?
But the only way to get that data and to get that information
would be to do this, right? And and because of that, I don't think it's ethical to do this at all, because we don't know, and the only way to know is to do it. I just don't think it's fair, right? And the third thing, which is on a lower level, a lower tier, is these children will forever, their entire lives will be scrutinized by the scientific community and what I mean?
Will the scientific community, will we know who these two kids are, though?
Oh, yeah, they've already released their names and everything.
Oh.
And so this brings up the next point of how he went about this, I think, was also pretty unethical, was to be part of this experiment. Any human experiment, you need to sign a consent form. Mm-hmm. And so not only was he preying upon a very vulnerable population, right? I can promise you a child that may not have this terrible disease, right? In consenting to have this procedure done, they also are required, the parents are required to bring the children to the hospital. I don't know how many, it didn't say specifically how many times, but it did say in the article that they're required to be under medical surveillance by this particular researcher until they're at least 18 years old.
Well, didn't it say that he would cover their medical insurance? He covers their medical...
He covers their medical insurance, but if they choose to leave, then they have to reimburse him.
What?
Yeah. And, right. So, there's a lot of, so there's a lot of, ooh, I think that's coercion, or, ooh, that's kind of blackmail. You can't do that. And... yeah, so I think that their whole lives, they're just going to be, sure, parts of their lives, they may be free to be normal children, but, would you want to have to go to the researcher and have them poking and prodding at you and, taking all these tests and having you under surveillance, your entire life? And you're, the first, we all still remember, Dolly the sheep, the first cloned, animal. This is a human being now. They're going to be infamous forever.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And, that's not something they signed up for. That has nothing to do with anything they did.
Yeah, but their their parents made this decision for them.
Yes.
And as parents, they take on that responsibility of, making the best informed decision for their kids.
Right. And I understand that in some cases that's perfectly fine. A parent chooses to give their child vaccines. And that is absolutely the right choice, in my opinion. It's just the right choice. And even though the child doesn't have any say over that, and it affects the child's health and the child's life, I do see how that is a good thing and perfectly fine.
Parents,
But, again, with these off-target effects, you don't know if you've just signed someone up to have an awful life.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
That is very true. And I'm in this situation, I'm like, there's known knowns, there's known unknowns,
and unknown unknowns. Yeah.
And so, like, these all, like,
target
effects are unknown unknowns.
Right.
And, like, these parents with their knowns and the known unknowns, like, they made the decision that, like, they would rather have their child go through this, like, procedure with the possibility of not living with HIV.
Mm-hmm. Right. To them, any unknown was less adverse than the possibility or having HIV.
Which still sucks for the twin that, like, was born...
Right.
Born without, like, this still has, like, some receptors are still...
Right.
Like,
and so that's another thing that was cited as potentially being unethical, is, like, if you were the researcher and you were truly trying to protect against HIV, why would you allow this particular embryo that it was not successful in? Because you know that before it gets implanted in the woman. Oh. So you know, like, oh, that's how, because they got many, and you have to do the procedure on a bunch, and it's like, oh, that one failed, oh, this one worked, this one half worked. If you're really trying to protect against HIV, you'd be like, only ones that worked 100% get to move on. But because that's not the case, and I think it did say that the parents were allowed to be involved in that decision. So it could be that he was telling them the full risk, but was like, this one might still be viable. So
there are a lot of factors
in that decision. But it just seems a little, especially given all the unknown unknowns, it seems very risky. Yes. Because now you've got no benefit to this child and only unknown unknowns. And something else to point out is that what we do know about this is that without that gene, without that receptor, you cannot get HIV, but you are at a higher risk to get some other diseases. And you're at a higher risk of, like, dying from things like the flu. So it's not all benefits and none of the risk. Like, there's pros and cons to this, just as there are pros and cons to not having it. Yeah. But I can understand how, looking at that list, you might still think, well, the benefit of not getting HIV outweighs the additional risks. Yeah, the cons. Yeah. So yeah, how do you feel about designer babies and what this is opening the door to?
Well, it's definitely opened the door, like, to the future. And I think, like, in the future, there will be, like, rich people that will be able to, like, design a baby and be able to, like, give them all of the resources. Or, like, in a lot of ways... This is just
another way of giving them a resource.
It's basically going to become, like, a resource. Which I think rich people already have, like, a lot of, like, benefits and resources. Mm-hmm. And I think in our capitalistic society, like, somebody's going to find a way to make a buck off this. And that's going to be the driving force behind, like, getting this approved. And I, like...
But do you...
I'm personally, like... I wouldn't want to have, like, a society that is, like, has genetically altered, like, humans. Mm-hmm.
And how come?
Because I think, like, it's just too much power, and I think that power, like, is going to become corrupt, and it's only going to lead to, like, a more, like, haves and have-nots. Mm-hmm. And, like, the middle class is going to
disappear, and it's just going to be...
Yeah, it's going to create wider separations. And we already, like, there's a lot of variable that goes into life. And I personally don't think that, like, humans should, outside of, like, what we can naturally do and mm-hmm. what we can naturally give our, like, children, we shouldn't be we shouldn't be dictating and controlling those variables.
Mm-hmm.
But if you I could see the argument being made that genetically engineering your baby it's just another variable that I can control. So why not just let me control it? It's no different than sending my kid to a private school versus a public school.
If you have the money, that's something you can do. If you don't have the money, then
I can understand and see that logic, but I would just hope that in society, we wouldn't want to go down that road.
Yeah.
And you brought up the point of he was doing it for the good of the good of society.
Right. It wasn't like he said, I'm going to allow your child you can pick your child's IQ, right? Which do you choose? He was truly in the realm of I'm trying to confer what a doctor would do, trying to help your health, not necessarily give you a leg up on other areas of your life.
I feel like they should have done a lot more testing though before.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
They're sending this child out into the world, and you're putting them at all types of risk. And he phrased it as I just wanted to do this and let the medical world and society figure out where we should go from here. Right. And I'm hold on, this is a kid's life.
Yes,
you shouldn't be
right.
You shouldn't just be doing something. Oh, I just want to do this to see how it turns out, and let the rest of the world.
If that's how you feel, you can do it in another animal model. You know what I mean? You can prove that this technique works. You can see what some of the off-target effects are. And granted, it would be terrible if you were to bring, a living, breathing animal life in that then suffered. But that's infinitely better than that being a human life, right? Agreed. And it's already allowed to do animal testing if you do it in an ethical manner, right? So I completely, and I agree with you. It's interesting in the article, and his collaborator at Rice, the American collaborator, phrased it very much as, oh, it's just like a vaccine, right? And that was part of the actual title of the project was HIV Vaccine Development Project. And so the consent form, one of the ethical things I was going to talk about was that it wasn't very clear from reading that this wasn't an actual vaccine, but a vaccine is very different than genetic editing, right? But the concept is very similar, which I kind of agree with when the guy from Rice was well, it's just like a vaccine. I kind of see the parallels.
But
right?
From my understanding, if you're giving me a vaccine, then
it's not changing your DNA. Right. And I agree with that. So the nitty-gritty details are very different. It looked like the computer froze. So the nitty-gritty details are very different. Right? You get a vaccine, your DNA is not changed. You're still you. You have all the flaws, all the awesome things about you. Mm-hmm. Right? This procedure, now your DNA is changed. But the outcome is similar, right? A vaccine helps you prevent disease, very terrible, burdensome disease, and in this case, it's also doing that. So, I might be okay with a society in which it's okay, we want to have a baby, and we know that we can prevent these 3 diseases, right? Because we've tested this all in animals, we know there's no off-target effects, or whatever off-target effects there are, we've changed it, right? Or we did enough computer simulations because we fully understand the human genome now, and we know for sure that there's going to be no off-target effects, and you can prevent your child from having, this, this, and this. Mm-hmm. I could see that being okay, my insurance covers it, or this is part of the routine care. I'm not sure I would have a problem with that if it helps eradicate certain diseases. But I would have a problem if it was used for anything else. I just want my child to be really smart, or I want my child to be,
And I think that's where
or my one child has a awful disease and needs a kidney donor. I want another child, and I want it to be engineered so it's a perfect match. You know what I mean? I could see things.
Oh, so hold on, so that wouldn't be okay in your...
Not okay at all.
How is that not okay?
Because you can't just
how can one
you can't just choose to have a baby in order to and force that baby to give its organs to the other baby.
But as an adult, like as a parent, like you make the best decisions for the kids, and like in order for like if you're willing to have another baby, like that's still in my mind that's still under the health of like society.
The first baby.
Yeah.
But so that's the thing. It's like I'm willing to make decisions that help child A's health and decisions that make child B's health. But I don't think it's fair to say I'm going to make a decision about child B's health and life to help child A. Like, I think it is fair to say I'm going to make a decision about child B's health and life to help child B. But donating a kidney is not good for the donor. Like, yeah, you can survive it, and yeah, it can be not, like, a huge deal, but it's not, like, good. It's not helpful for their life. It's detrimental for their life.
But it's, like, health-wise is something that can be managed. Like, if you know this going
I mean, it can be, but every time you go under anesthesia, there's a possibility you don't come back out. Right? So you're literally asking someone to risk their life. And I agree with you. Like, if I was the parent, I would be like, sign me up, take my kidney. Like, you know, I will do anything I can to, like, find the kidney, but I'm not sure it's ethical. It would be fine if the child was a perfect match and they let the child become 18 and there was no pressure. Be like, would you be willing to donate your
There's
kidney?
no pressure to donate your kidney to your brother or sister.
Well, that's the thing. Is like, is it ever going to be... Like, if the child truly wanted to do it out of the goodness of their heart, that would be one thing. But I feel like knowing... I just feel like it'd be very hard...
For the child.
For the child to feel like I'm truly in a safe space, whereas if I said no, it's okay.
Well, in my book... If you wanted to have a kid...
And we got kind of off topic. But anyhow, so my point is...
That would be under the same umbrella.
For you, yeah. Okay. So I feel like we are in agreement that this technique could be beneficial for society, and if used responsibly... Yes.
I am very worried about it being used
responsibly. Oh, yeah. I mean, we're human beings. Like, there are so few things we can do responsibly. Like collectively as a, a
group. And agree on, like...
And agree on what's responsible versus what's not. So anyway, I just thought this was very interesting, and kind of along that same line, I think that's partially why the researcher, just like you were saying, he was quoted as saying, I'm just going to do this and you guys can figure out the ramifications. Because he full well knows we're never going to agree on this hot button topic, and I'm just trying to push things forward, so I'm not going to ask for permission, I'm going to ask for forgiveness, right? And like, so, yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. So I definitely, like, think that it would be interesting to have, like, this as a discussion piece. And just having genetically engineered people, like, where would it stop?
Right.
And like, it seemed to me that, like, in the article, they were questioning whether or not, like, everyone, like, all the participants, if they had full understanding of the ramifications.
Right.
And I don't know how, like, I'm a very skeptical person,
mm-hmm.
and I could see somebody, like, preying on, like, people who don't understand the complete ramifications.
Right. And so that's partly why I felt like one of the ways he went about this experiment was unethical. Even if all of the science was perfectly legal, and even if he knew all the off-target effects, like, even if all of those things, I felt like he was preying upon a very vulnerable population and presenting his intervention in kind of a, like, sleight of hands, like, not really going to explain Magician, it to you. In a deceiving, like, a way that's not fully open and not fully trying to get them to truly understand. But
he would have never got this past the IRB.
Yeah. Exactly. So I feel like that was unethical. Yeah. And the whole, like, if you choose to leave this experiment, you have to pay me back, and, like, all this stuff. It's also, you know, an offering to pay for all the medical costs. It's very much taking advantage of people that don't have the financial means. So...
Shady individual.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting. But it also kind of you know, when in vitro fertilization was becoming a thing, there was a big uproar, and now I feel like it's pretty standard.
Pretty common.
Yeah. And that kind of paved the way for this, because if you didn't have that technique, you could do this, but there'd be nothing you could do with the embryo to bring it to a full-term baby.
Interesting concepts.
Yeah. I just remember we had an argument in high school biology class about in vitro fertilization.
We did not have this argument.
It got really awkward really fast.
How did it get awkward?
So I'm not gonna name any names, but
name names.
No, I'm not naming names.
Look you up on Facebook.
This was our IB class, so we have these like discussions all the time about things like this, and it was led by the teacher. So we were learning about mitosis, meiosis, and like genetics and all this stuff. And so we were having a class debate, and we all had to do research and come to class prepared and everything. And it was basically about, is in vitro fertilization ethical or unethical? Why or why not? And of course, there's no right answer. It's just a class discussion. And so one of my classmates is very religious, and she was like, I was brought up to believe that if you were not created by God, like, you don't have a soul and you're not going to go to heaven. And another student raised her hand and was like, well, I was a test tube baby. Does that mean I don't have a soul? And we were all just like, oh! and she goes, yes. Like, that's what I believe.
What?
And we were all just like, oh! And the teacher was like, I think we need to take a break. And so we all just went into the hallway and we were like, what just happened?
So all of us have a soul in here, so one of us.
Oh man, yeah. But again, it's like you wouldn't have known unless she had volunteered that information. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's just, yeah.
Everybody gets an A. See you at lunch.
I'm gonna rearrange some my seating chart in this class. Like, oh man. So anyway.
All right. Well, I think we are done for this episode. Thanks for the interesting study, China. Way to get us going.
Yeah.
All right. Well.
Thank you guys, and that is what we're here doing.
Deuces.